We're back from break. First half, I talked about business risk. Make sure you can explain to me what is business risk, what causes business risk, and in particular, make sure that you can explain to me what is operating leverage and how it affects that business risk. So that's a very, very important concept in finance. And now, when we get all done with a business, the company's got all these things that causes its business risk. And we say this company kind of falls in this risk category. So this one here has a lot of business risk, this one has very little business risk, and this one has kind of middle levels of business risk. And there could be a variety of different things. So you can have one with a high variability in demand, but a low amount of operating leverage, and maybe it ends up with average business risk. Might be a little bit high in all three of them and end up with high business risk. Might be a little bit low on all the different factors and so forth. But when we get all done, we want to have some grasp of how much business risk a company has. The second thing that we want to measure is how much financial risk. So I'll talk about financial risk. Now, business risk was the variability of earnings before interest and taxes, EBIT. Earnings before interest and taxes. The next question is, what if we bring interest and taxes into the picture and talk about how much variability that we have now? And the key word there is the interest. That's what causes the rest of that thing to kind of mess around a little bit. So what is financial risk? That's kind of where we're going to be addressing it. But before I do that, I need to talk about a word called financial. So I talked about operating leverage the first hour, didn't I? Now I'm going to talk about financial leverage. The word leverage is the key word that falls into both of these. I didn't mention it the first hour, but what does leverage mean in a physics sense? For those of you who remember back in your physics course, you remember you had these big objects and the individual person was not big enough and strong enough to move it, but if we used a lever, we could take and move that really big stone or big block or whatever it is by the force that that smaller individual could do there. And I think it was Archimedes that once said that if I had a place to stand and a big enough lever, I could move the world. Now think how big the world is. So it would take a pretty good sized lever, and I can't imagine how big a place to stand, but you could move it. Theoretically, because of the force that 100 or 200 pounds that an individual could exert on it would be enough to move the gazillions and zillions of pounds that the world would weigh. Well, all right, this is that same kind. Operating leverage, that's really what we were doing in the first hour. We were exerting a small force, and sometimes we made a lot of profits, and sometimes we made some really big losses. So when we use that operating leverage, we were using a lever. Same thing is true with financial leverage. Now we're going to talk about taking the small force and moving a large object. The large object that we're talking about here is the business. The small force is the stockholders. So how can we multiply the impact that the stockholders have? And the answer is financial leverage means the use of debt to finance our assets. The short definition of it, the use of debt to finance our assets. So if I'm using financial leverage, I'm trying to say, well, as a stockholder, I got this pile of money right here. And I can buy a bigger pile of assets. Say I got $100 of the stockholders got $100. Maybe I can buy $200 of assets if, let's see, I've got $100 and I borrow $100. So I've used debt to finance my assets. And I've used leverage. I've used a lever. I've used a lever, not in the physical sense, but in the financial sense. So that's what we're talking about. So the financial leverage means the impact that the stockholders have, they can control more assets. They can control more assets, or the business can own more assets by using financial leverage. In fact, financial leverage, the more debt we borrow, the more debt we have, actually, the greater the financial leverage. Come straight ahead here for just a little bit. Now, let me talk about it. We're going to buy a house, and let's see, I could put up half the money in cash and borrow half of the money, and that's not using much financial leverage, at least in terms of buying a house. But I could also put 20% down and borrow the other 80%. Now, with a relatively smaller down payment, I can buy a big house. And I've used more financial leverage. So it's how much of the... Now, the extreme that we got into here in the United States back 4 or 5 years ago is people were putting how much down? 0, and borrowing the entire cost of the house. Well, how much financial leverage have they used now? A lot. An awful lot. And so they control, with no down payment or 1% down payment or something like that, they were able to control a huge asset. And if things worked out well, they did quite well. And when things didn't work out well, what happened? Well, we got the mess where the economy's in right now. We drive around the city of Flint, there's a lot of empty houses for a variety of reasons, but part of which is people bought them without putting anything down, and when things went bad, everything went bad. So we multiplied our profits and losses, financial leverage. All right, financial risk. What is financial risk? Remember, our concern is with the stockholders. Remember, the goal of the firm is to create some value for the stockholders. Financial risk is the variability in earnings available, if I could spell it, that's available. The variability in earnings available to the stockholders caused by financial leverage. The variability in earnings available to the stockholders caused by financial leverage, or you could say it's caused by using debt. Financial leverage means using debt. So you can either use financial leverage or just using debt, however you want to try and get that under control. Now, the way I like to do this one, operating leverage I showed with a graph, or a series of graphs. What I would like to do here is to go through a numerical example which illustrates how this works. And I have been known to quite regularly ask for this numerical example on the exam. And so I'll say on the exam, create me a numerical example to illustrate financial leverage, something like that. So create me a numerical example to illustrate financial leverage. Now, you don't have to memorize my numbers. You can use any set of numbers you want. But the process and the procedure, commit to memory here, okay? Remember, we had a company that was labor intensive and capital intensive. Well, once again, we're going to have two companies in same industry. So two identical companies, the same industry, producing identical products. and so forth, all, same operating leverage, down the line. What differs is the amount of financial leverage. How much each of them is borrowed. So two companies, same industry, produce identical products the same way, whatever, all you wanted is, so just two companies. What differs is the amount of financial leverage. That's the key part here. What differs is the amount of financial leverage. So that's the part that I want you to grasp. Let's look at the two companies. We'll come up with Firm A. And let's see, if I call one Firm A, what should I call the other one? Firm B, that's a good one. I don't know why we don't go Firm A and Firm Z or something like that. Why do we go always Firm A and Firm B? Firm A has debt where they pay 10% interest, which is pretty high, but just to give the numbers some numbers, of $200. The stockholders have put in $800. Remember, assets equal liabilities plus ownership? That basic kind of equation. So they would have assets then of $1,000. Now, some people say, well, come on. Put 8 more zeros after that if you want. Put all the zeros that make you happy. Whatever makes you happy. Put a lot more zeros there. I could say $2 and $8 and $10, but it was something like that. Okay. Firm B has $500 of debt and $500 from the stockholders. It also has $1,000 of assets. So the only difference is how much financial leverage. This Firm B is used more, Firm A is used less financial leverage. Everybody's good with that. Okay. What I want to do is I want to take a look at both of these companies. I'll do company A first, and then I'll do company B. And what I'll do is say, all right, what happens when it has a poor year? So we're going to do Firm A first. What happens when it has a poor year, an average year, and a good year? Poor, average, and good year. Don't sell hardly anything. Yeah, so, and we have a great year. We define a poor year as based upon that term EBIT, that net operating income, so revenue minus expenses. The poor year, we have $80. The average year, we have $120. And in the good year, we have $200. Now, once again, don't memorize my numbers, just kind of memorize the way things flow through here and create any numbers you want. Earnings before interest and taxes. And we want to get this down to how much earnings the stockholders have. Do I subtract the taxes first, or do I subtract the interest first? EBIT, to get this down to earnings. Remember, interest is tax deductible. Taxes bias business decisions. So we subtract out the interest, and because we want to find out how much taxable income we have, and then we subtract out a tax, and that will be how much money is left for the stockholders. Now, I'm kind of keep referring back to this. Firm A had $200 of debt and 10% interest on that debt. So how much will Firm A pay for interest in a poor year? $20, 10%, right? So I'll write 10% over here just so if you need to remind yourself. In an average year, how much will firm A pay for interest? Well, it's still got $200 of debt. It's paying 10%, so it's paying $20. What about a good year? Is there something that looks something similar to what we did the first hour? Interest is a fixed cost. That's why we call this leverage. Operating leverage meant we had an operating fixed cost. Financial leverage means we have a financial fixed cost. So they're both based on fixed costs, and that's why I talked about operating leverage first, and now I'm talking about financial leverage, because both cases we're incurring a fixed cost. And that fixed cost is there whether it was a poor year, an average year, or a good year. So if you wanted to draw this, we could draw this same thing out on a graph, and now we'd have a fixed cost line there of $20 going right across there, because that's what it would be. That would, so if we take EBIT, subtract the interest from it, well, if I drop the I out of there, what do I end up with? Earnings before taxes, EBT. So that'd be what, 60, 100, and $180. Now, we have to subtract T, or taxes. Now, I think I indicated earlier 40% is kind of a good number to use, except 40% is a difficult number to multiply a lot of numbers by. And so I recommend using 50%, only because it's easy. Don't use 0 and don't use 100. So anything in between will work. Anything in between will work. The higher the number, the more emphasis you get, but it doesn't matter. I just use 50%. Not because it's realistic, but just because it's easy. Because I can take 50% of 60 and say that that is 30. I can take 50% of 100 and say that that's 50. And I can take 50% of 180 and say that's 90. If I got to multiply that by 40%, that would be what? 24, 40, and 72? A little more difficult. And that leaves us with E, or earnings. So this is the earnings that the stockholders get. See, I subtracted that. I want to subtract this also. Put those lines in just so that you can figure out what I'm doing. This is 30, this is 50, and this is 90. Now, like I said, use your own numbers. Don't try and memorize them, but you got to memorize this coming from EBIT minus I minus T. That part you got to get down. Now, we want to know how well did the stockholders do. And the way we usually do that is we look at something called return on investment. That's kind of the normal ways how well did we do. And if we're talking about the stockholders, we really call that ROE, which refers to the return on the stockholders' investment. We call it return on equity is really what it stands for. ROE stands for, if you want to make a note there, it's return on equity, meaning how well did the stockholders do. And let's see, here we made $30 of profit, and how much did the stockholders have invested in the business for business A? That was that 800. And I think that's 3.75%, and only because I have it written down next to me. And then this one would be what, 50 over 800, and that's 6.25%. And this is 90 over 800, and this turns out to be 11.25%. So firm A, as we kind of go through a business cycle, it has some business risk. The question is, what about firm B, producing the same product in the same industry with the same technology and the same everything else, but now they've used a lot more financial leverage? What about firm B? How much, what's their ROE going to look like? So if you want to jump ahead, for those of you that are really fast and want to turn the sound off and figure out what I'm doing, I'm going to do this same table. The only thing that's going to change up here, well, a lot of things are going to change, but the main thing is going to change. Instead of this being an A, this is going to be a B. So firm B. So let's set up that same table. We'll put a B up here on top. We'll have a poor year, an average year, and a good year. We measure that by EBIT, it's operating income, and it's the same because it's the same industry, same product, same everything. So it's doing as well as everybody else. So poor year is 80, average year is 120, and a good year, oh, I got 200 up here, 200. Well, it doesn't look like anything's going to change. Well, maybe something is going to change. Because firm B also pays 10% interest. But how much interest is it paying on? It's paying interest on the $500. So 10% of the $500 is now $50 of interest. And it is also a fixed cost, meaning we're going to pay that poor, average, or good year. It's that leverage again. It's that leveraging effect taking place. Now you want to use 8% or 5% or 2% or whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Now we end up with the earnings before taxes of 30, 70, and 150, if I've got my numbers right. I'm still going to do taxes at 50% just because I can do those. Kevin, not that it really matters, but the clock's not running. Taxes will be 15, 35, and 75. And what are we going to have with earnings here then? Well, one of the neat things about using a tax rate of 50%, if you can figure out the taxes, you can also figure out the earnings. It's going to be the same number, because you're just splitting it between earnings and taxes. Now, one thing to note here, and some people get a little bit confused on this. Notice here, poor year, we made 30, and now they're only making 15. Here it's 50, and now it's 35, and it's 90. In other words, firm B has lower earnings all the way across. But it's not the earnings that we're concerned with. It's how well did the stockholders do relative to their investment. How well did the stockholders do relative to their investment? And now the stockholders have only have an investment here of $500. So yeah, it makes sense that they don't have as much money because they didn't put as much money into the game. So now our ROE is 15 over 500, which is 3%. 35 over 500, which is 7%, and 75 over 500, which is 15%. Okay? which company has more business risk? All right. 3.75, 6 1/4, 11 1/4. This company does not have much financial leverage, and yeah, there's variability when it goes through a business cycle, but compare it to the variability. Let me just write the other one. This is firm A. Let me just write firm B's numbers down here. What, 3%, 7%, and 15%. So I can just put it all on one sheet here. Which one has more risk? B's got a lot more risk. We've brought in financial leverage, and now we've put our stockholders in a riskier situation. We've said to the stockholders, if things go well, you can make a lot of money. Operating leverage. When things go well, you make a lot of money. Financial leverage. When things go well, you make a lot of money. Things are okay, you still do a little better. But when things go bad, things go bad. Things go bad, things go bad. Okay? So we have to be very, very careful about that. Now, would you want to invest, let me come straight ahead here for a second. Would you want to invest in a company that has a lot of operating leverage and a lot of business risk, and that company also has a lot of financial leverage? When things go well, things really are going to go well. You're going to make lots and lots of money. However, when things go bad, the operating leverage is going to kill you, the business risk is going to kill you, and since you've become so highly financially levered, you're also going to get hurt badly because of that. So you got a lot of risk out there. So what people say is, maybe I better draw a final conclusion here, then I'll go on. Conclusion. The increase in financial leverage caused increased financial risk. Very careful about that. It causes a lot of financial risk. As a stockholder, we're going to be concerned about that. We're going to be greatly concerned about that. And so some of the authors and some of the textbooks, they go into some long, complicated formulas, and you figure out what's called the combined leverage effect. Well, I don't want it. It's just a huge formula. You'll never memorize it. You never have any idea about it. So I don't do it that way. What I go is something like this. I say my stockholders required return. I'm a stockholder. I'm going to make an investment. There's going to be three things that impact that stockholder's required return. The first thing is the risk-free rate of return. So if I'm a stockholder, you better give me at least as much money as you're getting on U.S. government securities. But there's a risk-return trade-off. And I'm just going to make an additive function, although it may or may not be. Plus, you need to compensate me for what we called business risk. Plus financial risk. So if I'm a stockholder, give me something to cover the risk-free rate of return, and then let me see what kind of industry you're in, what kind of products you're producing, how you're producing it, and all that other stuff. That's the business risk. And then let me see how you finance those assets. and that's the financial risk. And I need to be compensated. Now, I can have an industry with a high business risk, and if I'm smart, let me rephrase this, if I'm smart / cautious / something, prudent, if I have a lot of business risk, I probably ought to keep my financial risk somewhat minimized. If, however, I am in an industry with very low business risk, nice stable products, nice stable consumers, stable cost structure, not much operating leverage, this nice stable way of doing things, then I can probably go out and borrow a lot of money. I can incur that financial leverage. But it's the impact of the two together that I got to be careful about. And whether it's just a straight additive function the way I've got it here, or where there's some interactions and all that other stuff, we won't worry about that. It's just, for my purposes, it's just a straight additive function across there. So as a manager, I have to make some kind of decisions about this. And last week, one last comment on this particular form. Remember last week I did the weighted average cost of capital. I said there was the Gordon model for coming up with the stockholders' required rate of return. There was the security market line model. And then I'm going to hold 3 for now, which was that all else fail. What I've really shown you here is a third model. This could be a third model that could be used in the weighted average cost of capital. I don't have any problems like that. I'm not going to hold you responsible within the context of that. But whenever I told you they're somewhere between 40 and 40% because there are all these different models out there, well, here's another model. Here's another model that could be used to estimate the weighted average cost of capital. And you look at a company, you say, all right, U.S. government securities are this, and it's in an industry with a lot of business risk, and the way they're producing the products got a lot of business risk, so we probably put a healthy amount in there for business risk. And then we take a look at how are they financing their assets, and we do that also. So all of those factors kind of come in together. So remember that. Now, I have one last little topic here, and then you're going to be out early here tonight. The question is, how do we measure the amount of financial leverage? How do we measure the amount of financial leverage? There's going to be 2 possible ways, but I need to, before I even get that far, I need to talk about something called a continuum. And how do you spell the word continuum? It's a really strange word in the English language because it's got 2 U's in a row. And that's a very unusual word. People never want to spell it that way. So it's C-O-N-T-I-N-U, continuum. Continuum. So it's a continuum. We have something called a continuum. And what we're talking about by what's meant by a continuum? It means continuum means I can be at this end, or I can be at this end, or I can be any place along the way in between. That's what's meant by a continuum. So there's an infinite number of points that falls along this line. So what I'm talking about here is on one side, one extreme, we have debt. In the other extreme, we have common stock. And companies don't just have debt, and they don't just have common stock. There's all different kinds of debt, and there's a variety of different stocks, including preferred stock. And so when we talk about how a company finances its assets, we don't just ask ourselves the question, well, how much debt do they have? How much bonds do they have? And how much common stock do they have? Because they really got all kinds of funny mixtures of things. For example, as part of this, they could have what we would call current liabilities. And that's, accounts payable, notes payable, wages payable, taxes payable, all those kinds of things. In here, when we're talking about financial leverage, just in this class, we're not going to have any current liabilities. But we will have things like mortgages, we'll have things like debentures, there's things called, I don't even have room to write them all down here, subordinated debentures. There's things called convertible bonds or convertible debentures. That's what's meant by a continuum. It's just a large number of things that fall in here. There's things like preferred stock, which is not really quite debt, and it's not really common stock. It's on this continuing somewhere sliding along here. Now, companies, there's an infinite number of things the way they can arrange this. And the list of things that fall on that line gets more complex every year as the human mind gets more creative and figures out some new ways of issuing things. And there's an infinite number of points along here. Now, if we wanted to measure the amount of financial leverage, it would be just ultimately too complicated. So what we do in finance is we restrict ourselves, instead of a continuum, we just restrict themselves to having either debt, whatever debt means, and common stock. And that's the only two alternatives. So they either have debt or they have common stock. And sometimes, instead of calling the word common stock, we use the phrase or the word equity. So the word equity and common stock in here mean about the same thing. Because we're only going to have either debt or we're going to have equity or common stock. Now, a company has so much debt and it has so much common stock. There's two ways we can measure the amount of financial leverage. The first way, and this is the way your textbook does it, is they take the total debt or total liabilities, if you want to phrase it that way, and divide it by the total assets. Does that make sense? How much of our assets were financed by debt, and that is what we meant by financial leverage. And this number can go anywhere from 0 to 100%, right? Well, 100% you borrowed everything. So 100% is buying the house with no down payment. And 0% means you paid cash. Now, not too many people, especially young people, pay cash for a house. And they'll have total debt to total assets, maybe 20% or 25%, where they put down 20 or 25% of the cost of the house, and that would be the way to do it. That's the way it's done in the textbook. I don't like that way. And that's not the more common way. The more common way that it is done in practice, so I want to really do it with what you more commonly see, it's something called a DE ratio. And I once had a student on a live class that apparently didn't have very good eyesight. And he was sitting in the back of the class, the hand went up and he said, "What's that DIE ratio?" D-I-E, couldn't read, they read the slash as an I, the DIE ratio. I said, "You're going to die in this class because it's not a DIE ratio, it's known as the debt to equity ratio. And that's equal to our total debt over the amount of common stock. Or I'm just going to use the word stock. Debt equity ratio. It's the most common way we talk about How much financial leverage? So the debt equity ratio, this ratio has as a low number 0. And it approaches infinity. What would that mean? If I bought that house with 0 down, my debt would be 100 and my own equity would be 0. What's 100 over 0? It depends how you study math and how old you are. We used to call it infinity, now they call it undefined, and yeah, big number. It's a big number, okay? So this goes from 0 to 100, this one goes from, we're going to do it this way here. So when I ask the amount of financial leverage, I'm going to be talking about a debt equity ratio. And next week, we're going to address the question, well, what debt equity ratio should a company have? What do you think would be a good one? 0? 0 seems a wee bit conservative. And 100 or infinity seems a wee bit something else. And so it's somewhere between 0 and we're going to look at a couple of different models that people have developed over time to lead us to some kind of conclusion. And so that's kind of what next week's lecture is all about, is which of those. Now, I want to go back and see if I can find something here where I hit the two companies, the A and B company. Where was that thing? There we go. Question I asked on last year's exam, and I might do it this year, is I said, how do we measure the amount of financial leverage? And I just gave you two ways, but the answer I really want is the debt equity ratio. What would be and then I said, create a numerical example. And you can't believe how many people couldn't create a numerical example. What's the DE ratio or die ratio for firm A? Well, let's see, it'd be equal to 200 over 800, or 25%. And incidentally, that's quite low, but that's what it would be. What would be the debt equity ratio for firm B? 500 over 500, or you can either write that as an index number of 1, or you can write it as a percent. I think it's more common to write it as a percent. So say it's 100%. And you notice that's not a huge amount of financial leverage. So 100% sounds big, but it's not overly big. One of the advantages of the DE ratio is it spreads it out faster than the debt to assets, because there you can only go from 0 to 100. Here you can go from 0 to big numbers. So this tends to spread it out and emphasize companies that are highly levered. So remember that. Just if I were to ask that question, I snuck it in last year. I don't know if I'll sneak it in again this year or not, but be prepared. Well, the amount of financial leverage and then the debt equity ratio. This is the debt equity ratio, and be able to give me a numerical example. Okay, tonight I promised you a short class. And good to my word, I'm going to keep it short. Next week is two models to answer the question, what is the appropriate debt equity ratio? And that's a little bit complicated, because this one you're going to have to really think your way through. In the textbook, the new edition of the textbook does not have a good explanation. The older editions of the textbook gave a better explanation of that. And then also I'm going to talk a little bit about dividend policy, just so give you a heads up so you have some terminology on that. So that's what we're going to do next week. In the meantime, it's Miller time.